to episode 26 of Last Turn. I'm Bart, and I'm here with Evan. How are you this morning?
I'm chipper. I'm chipper as a chip.
Are chips chipper?
I mean, if they aren't, then what is?
The things that break up chips are chippers, right? Wood chippers?
That's true. I guess the chips are just chip. Like, if they were chipper, they would be called chipper.
That is true. Yes.
I'm glad we figured that out.
Yep, alright. We'll catch you guys next week.
That's exciting.
that was the episode, chips. So, what I'm not chipper about is the fact that Hearthstone still looks the same as it did the last time we recorded.
It definitely is similar to a series of chips and chippers, and then chips and then chippers.
Yes, that.
There's like Tempo Rogue is like the chips, and then razakus is the chipper. And
razakus is definitely a chipper, because I mean, like, Psychic Stream is one hell of a chipper.
Yeah, that'll chip a Void Lord.
Yep.
Or
yeah, that'll chip a
three
Void Lord.
even.
Or, I mean, it'll also chip, like, your Flame Elementals, and that chips you, because it chips your deck.
Yeah, I had I forget how I wound up with an Onyxia as razakus, but I played it. I actually was probably playing Dragon razakus. And then my opponent Psychic Screamed, and I was like, oh no.
Oh,
I
no.
have 6 whelps. Whelp.
Yeah,
Whelp. Whelp.
That's terrible. Yeah, I mean, if they get you to skip some draw steps, that's actually pretty good. It is like a hidden upside of that card.
Yeah, I mean that was the first time I saw it used like that.
Right.
You know, because I had like 8 cards left in my deck, so the fact that suddenly it was 15, 6 of which were dead draws was, that really hurt my odds.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
That's more than 33%.
For sure. That's pretty. I mean, at least they're dragons. You can use them to trigger like Nether Spite Historian and Operative.
Yeah, or the razakus, the hero power. But I was definitely too far behind. It was a very good play on that person's part. But yeah, I mean there's a lot of rogue and cube lock and priest. I think cube lock's I feel like I've been seeing more of it. I'm not sure if it's just from changing rank or if more people are playing it, but it's a very strong deck.
Yeah, I definitely saw a lot of it at the end of last season. I think people caught on to it being really strong pretty quickly, because it's able to sort of steal a win with Doom Guards, but at the end of the day, I think it's just the best shell for like a possessed lackey Voidlord deck. So,
yeah, I mean that combo is just insane. And then I mean a lot of it to me is the nonsense with Doomguard and the cube. Doomguard and the cube. You can just I almost said Doom Garden. It sounds like a metal band. But you could just get killed out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So that gives it a whole lot of reach.
Yeah, I mean that's always a good thing. Like if you can kill your opponent quickly from hand, then whatever you're doing is pretty strong. I think they like to avoid designing cards and mechanics like that.
Well, there you guys. It's also the other deck that is basically, I think, has an advantage over, which is razakus, that does the same thing.
Right.
And that's really why that deck is good against cube lock, is because the Void Lords don't matter. They can just go around them.
Yeah, that's how I thought of it too. I mean, if I kind of had this mental agreement with myself that if cube lock ever became too prevalent, such that I was queuing into it like every game or something, I would just switch to razakus. I feel like that matchup, you're heavily favored as priest.
Yep, you're gonna have Psychic Scream, which we already mentioned, is gonna be really good against their Void Lords or their cubes, especially if they put some work into it.
Right.
And you also really benefit from them doing face damage to themselves.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like if you're playing an aggro deck and they deal damage to themselves, but then they play a Void Lord, it didn't help you that much. But if you're just trying to Mind Blast them, they might have actually just put themselves into lethal range without knowing it.
Yeah, I've had like relatively fast draws with razakus where you end up drawing like your 1, 2, and 3 mana minions, and if you're against Q block and they have like a slow draw, they don't draw any early taunts or a possessed lackey or something, you can end up chipping in for a bunch of damage, and they don't respect that because you're a priest and you're probably not killing with minions. But then you can just like mind blast them later and end the game without razakus combo. I've had that happen to me.
Yeah, and they're playing the kobold,
Right,
um,
the
and
librarian.
and even the sometimes the homunculus. So they're doing all this damage to themselves. They're tapping because you're not putting many threats out beyond those first three, so they have a lot of time to damage themselves.
Hmm.
And I had made a razakus potion. It was like 7. It was draw 2 and deal 5.
Right.
And then I drew Mind Blast, and they were 10. I was like, oh, I won. Cool.
Yep. Yeah, I've had games like that. I haven't played a lot of razakus this season. I've been mostly playing Tempo Rogue. That deck just feels so strong.
I was enjoying it, but I just like playing razakus a lot, so that's what I've been playing.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I ultimately I think it depends on the environment and what you intend to fight. Razakus probably is like a little bit more resilient, but Tempo Rogue, that deck just feels so strong. I feel like it has such a good game against pretty much everything. I like the fact that it has so many cards like Vile Spine, Spellbreakers, and stuff that mean you don't auto lose to Voidlord. And like, not that
Yeah,
Razakus loses to Voidlord, but compared to other minion decks, they can feel really weak to that card. But Tempo Rogue is like pretty well positioned to deal with it while also being able to not auto lose to like Aggro Paladin.
yeah. It's also got fireflies and the hero power
Yeah,
for that matchup, and yeah, Spellbreaker. Um, that's a really big card right now.
yeah.
I noticed this image tweeted by Last Turn. Um, that's us guys, and it's mentioning the most popular cards and is this tournament stats?
Actually, no. This was from HS Replay, just like kind of all ranks on the ladder.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So, all ranks on ladder, 28.7% of them are playing Spellbreaker.
Yep, 28% of 0.7% of decks. Pretty insane.
And yeah, so that I think is very largely due to Void Lord. I think that's a big
Yeah.
reason. Um, and then also just his buddies that hang out with him, like the cube that will destroy him, um, or the faceless manipulator that will copy him. So you got a lot of targets in that deck.
Also Bone Mare. Bone Mare's around still.
Yep, Bomare's right below him on that list at 25%.
Yep. Yeah, I think so. But I think that Void Lord certainly drives part of the popularity. Spellbreaker was definitely like catching on during Knights of the Frozen Throne. Um,
Yeah,
and I remember a lot of early decks were taking that in, and I thought like, oh, that's kind of surprising, but it makes sense.
yeah,
Because of Bone Mare.
it's not that bad of a deal. 4 mana, 4/3.
Yeah, that's fine.
And the 4 power will have resilience also against priest, and that's another popular class right now.
Yeah. Yeah, Automania, that silence effect is definitely worth like 1 mana. For a card that just silences something, I think 0 is the right price. But because 3 mana 4/3 is like the kind of the vanilla test.
Hmm.
So I think Spellbreaker is appropriately costed and like a good deal. I never feel bad if I just have to jam it. So
Yeah, it's fine, and also since you're playing Kelsith, it actually is just an added bonus that you have another answer that's got a body
yes,
as opposed to settling on like assassinate or something like that,
yeah,
which wouldn't
definitely.
benefit from Kelsith.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just beneficial to have more minions in your deck because it means that Kelesith is better. Also, Minstrel can fish it up, which is nice.
That is pretty handy. How many are you running?
In Minstrels,
The Spellbreakers.
I think in Tempo Rogue I oscillate between 0 and 1.
Okay, I was wondering if it got to the point where you wanted to.
Yeah, I never really felt like that because the deck just has Vile Spine, and I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not that scared of Void Lord. A lot of the games you can just kill them before it even comes out.
Or what about not playing Kelesith and using Sap?
That is something I would consider if I saw like a lot of Warlock, but I think if I was seeing that much Warlock that I wanted to cut Kelesith, I would just play Razakus.
Okay. I have here and there played Caliseth less
Tempo.
Tempo Rogue, and it worked really well. Um, Playing Galaka crawlers when there were a lot of pirates,
Yeah,
basically.
I could see that. I could see just swapping out Kelesith and maybe some of the weaker one drops for crawlers, saps, and other sort of hate. Well, it's spicy. People wouldn't see it coming, and that is certainly an advantage.
It worked really well. I think it was two crawlers and one eviscerate was one list, and then there was another point where I was using um, two eviscerates and a sap, just because there was a lot of bone mare, and so just having a way to go face or the best case scenario is they don't have a board to bone mare anything, so that's the two eviscerates. But if it does come out, you can sap their dude and smack their booty.
Yeah, I mean that sounds interesting. Maybe you can try that, but I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
not
it's something to consider if you do see that many warlocks.
sure. Sure. Yeah, the it's Warlocks. I don't know. It's super strong. I don't think you need to tech that hard with it against it rather as tempo rogue, but definitely worth considering. Or if you needed I guess like if you were building a tournament lineup and you were running a wacky lineup such that you really needed a way to deal with that deck, then it would make sense to do that. But I think you could probably just avoid building that kind of lineup.
Yeah, do you think that Tempo Rogue has a good game against Q Block?
I think it actually really depends on a few things. It depends on what their possessed lackey is doing when they play it. Like if they play it on 5 and it gets a Void Lord, then the game becomes a lot harder. Usually it's not the first Void Lord that kills you; it's the second one. So
Mm-hmm.
the the possessed lackey can carry them to the second, or it can just like chain into the cube so that they can just copy them. Because once they're duplicating the Void Lords, you're in a bad spot.
Yeah, you're not coming out on top of that one.
Yeah, that's but other than that, I mean, I think you put a ton of pressure on them, and they're a deck that can be pressured, right? They ultimately succumb to you developing your board and beating them down. So you just need to be really aggressive. It's kind of like against razakus. It's the kind of deck where you're not holding your SI7 agent on turn 3. You're just jamming it for the 3/3 body and trying to get damage in.
Yeah, that that actually makes me think. I've been trying to think of ways they could implement silence effects that aren't cancerous,
Hmm.
because the owl at 2 mana was cancerous,
Right.
and you just pointed out, oh, during that turn, this is all I needed to do. Maybe there could be a minion, it's like a 2 mana 2/2 silence a minion this turn,
Oh, I see. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Temporarily remove all their abilities. That's cool. Yeah,
and
because
it could
then
be on like a pretty good. It could be at a pretty good rate.
yeah,
Um,
that'd be
eh,
interesting.
then that would actually give you the opportunity to kill the minion. So maybe it would need to be maybe two for a 2/2 is too good, but
Yeah,
that forces you to also have the other cards available. So I think it's interesting.
I think the cheaper that effect is, I think 2 would probably be like the maybe the best it could be, maybe 3 depending on the stats.
Maybe if it were a well statted 3 drop, like a 3/3,
Yeah, or a 3/4 even.
that would be very a 3 mana 3/4 silence a minion this turn. That sounds like could be really good,
Yeah, yeah, that seems
but
strong.
not always good. Like, and you wouldn't put that in every deck.
No, certainly not.
And I think that's kind of what you want with your cards. You don't want this list on Twitter where
Right.
43% of decks are playing Corridor Creeper.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the obviously that kind of list is going to be biased. Like you can't look at that list and say these are all neutrals because that's looking across all decks. So obviously they're going to be neutrals. But like the fact that almost 50% of them are playing Corridor Creeper is still that's a problem, clearly.
And it's because of, like, this is something we were talking about, the nature of the metagame, and those top few cards, um, the top five really are all just insane tempo swings. The creeper can be a really cheap 5/5. Patches, we spent a whole episode talking about how much tempo patches gives you, and also when it gives it to you and how much that matters. And then Spellbreaker, Bone Mare. I mean, those are sort of tempo swings for the same reason. Bone Mare will give your guy a lot of stats, and then Spellbreaker can silence their Bone Mare target.
Sure, sure.
And then Captain, he's a 3 mana 5/5. That's a huge tempo swing.
Oh yeah.
With patches coming out as a 2/2, so you get 2 damage immediately, so you can kill something with 2 health, and get a body of your own as well.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the reason that card is so good. Um, so speaking of tempo, we on this episode wanted to talk a little bit about tempo as sort of an abstract concept. I think that a lot of what we've talked about so far in this episode and in previous episodes in reviewing the metagame has been about tempo, and like some of the decks that are really strong right now have tempo in their name. I mean, Tempo Rogue. A lot of them are minion-based decks that are ultimately capable of generating massive tempo swings and generating a lot of tempo all at once and just putting the opponent behind by very efficiently using resources and cards. So we wanted to discuss the concept in the abstract and how it applies to this game. It has pretty deep roots, as I've learned,
Mhm.
but I think we can sort of just focus on Hearthstone and talk a little bit about what it is and how to evaluate it when you're playing, how to sort of integrate it into the way that you think about the game and the board, and the ways to generate it, and also just some cards that are particularly good at getting it, but also, you know, some of the more, and how it's not just the same thing as board state.
Yeah, in Hearthstone, tempo matters a whole lot. But really, in every game, if you have more tempo than your opponent for enough time, you win. So that's like tempo is what is something that leads you to victory. So it's definitely an important thing to understand. Didn't you say that it originally was used to talk about chess?
Yeah, that's my understanding. It might even have earlier roots than that. Well, I mean, it does. Like tempo is a word that you use to describe like music and songs and stuff. But
Hmm.
uh, I think in games, the one of the earliest uses, if not the earliest, is in chess. You
That's
use it to.
cool.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, uh, it felt I think that that game is sufficiently different from Hearthstone that the definition in chess is only like analogous to how we use it. So it's something in chess. It's something like how efficiently you're using your turns to advance your position. Like if you're using your turns to put your opponent on the defensive, then you're gaining tempo.
I mean, that sounds very, very similar to the Hearthstone definition ultimately. But
Right,
that
right.
we're keeping you kept it extremely general.
Yes, exactly.
My first time hearing the term tempo was in Magic, which is definitely much more similar. But in Magic, it almost doesn't matter as much, or it doesn't revolve around the board as much. Really, in Hearthstone, tempo almost always is about the state of the board.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. So, in general, the working definition of tempo that we're going to use is it's an imaginary resource that you're getting when your position in the game becomes advantageous relative to your opponent. So that's, you know, general, but still specific enough to be useful. So how that could relate to the board is if you're playing a bunch of minions that could threaten to kill your opponent and they have to spend resources to deal with your minions instead of killing you, then you've gained a tempo advantage.
Yep, and if your minions are harder to kill, so your opponent will have to spend more to kill them, you've gained more tempo. Or if your minion maybe came out and did something like it made another minion, or it dealt damage to your opponent's face, or it had charge, or it just has a lot of attack power in addition to being resilient, you have even more tempo because your position is relatively even better, and your opponent is sort of negative more theoretical resources compared to you.
Right. Yeah. So it's yeah, the resources and options, you know, this is all it's all general terms because like So I've heard in the past reductionist definitions of tempo. So when I was a very young Hearthstone player, there were some articles out that were actually trying to quantify tempo,
Hmm.
and they had tempo quantified as these units that were just linearly related to your total stats on the board. At the time, as an inexperienced player, I didn't know any better. I mean, the person who wrote this article had thought a lot about it and was a much better player than me. Regularly participated in tournaments. Fortunately, I don't remember the author and I couldn't find the article, but um, nowadays, I actually think that's just very is missing the point. It's reductionist. It's like reducing the concept to something far too specific and trying to quantify it in a way that you can talk about it precisely, but you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater there. I think that a lot of the um, usefulness of tempo is in the things that you can't capture just with stats. So
Hmm.
you said, you play a minion, it does damage to face. A lot of people would say, like, that's absolutely not a tempo play. So there are some cases where it will be a tempo play. Let's say you can threaten 8 damage and your opponent's at 10, and you're threatening 8 damage on the board. You have one card in your hand. You play that one card in your hand, and it does damage to their face. It puts them at 8. Now, if they can't kill you immediately, they have to kill it. They can't just develop past your minions. They can't just develop and ignore your minions. They have to deal with them, otherwise you'll kill them. So you've taken resources away from them because you've forced them to spend at least some of their resources on the stuff that you've developed, or they lose. And that's the same thing as you're forcing their hand. You're taking away resources because they have to use their resources in a particular way. So they're effectively gone, or else the game is over.
Yeah, their alternatives are gone. Their options are gone, and that's why that's the definition we're using, that your position becomes better, because there's a lot of ways to have a better position. It's not necessarily just going to be reflected in stats on the board. Like in this example, you took away their options and therefore put yourself in a better position by saying, hey, you can't not kill these. You can't make plays that aren't killing these. All of
Right.
your non-killing these options are gone. So my position is improved, and that's sort of like when your opponent plays a bunch of 4 mana 7/7s, a bunch of Flame Wreath Facelesses, and other big minions. Suddenly you feel like, wow, there's not much I can do. That's an example of them getting a whole lot of tempo, and therefore giving you way fewer options.
Yeah, definitely. Like, because even if you play something, it's probably gonna you play something scary and big, it's gonna just die to what they have on board, and or just not be able to deal with it.
Yeah,
Um,
like you could play a Raza, which normally a few turns later you play Shadow Reaper Anduin, and you're just you're beating everybody with that. But if your
yeah,
opponent has gotten you down to 14 and they have 2/7/7s, then that's not going to happen.
yeah,
They
right,
got
right.
they probably had more tempo than you on the first turn with a Tunnel Trog, and they continued to maintain a tempo advantage, and that meant that they won.
Yep, yeah. I mean, tempo is snowbally. The reason early tempo matters a lot. That's something we talked about in the last episode, and that's because you can convert tempo on turn one. Tempo differentials on turn one are going to be pretty small. It's going to be like a 1-1 versus your opponent not having anything. But that you later on you can convert that to sticking your 2/2, which you can convert to sticking your 3/3 or 4/4. So
Yep, there's
um,
that snowball.
yeah, that's maintaining a tempo advantage over your opponent, on your opponent for many turns is something that is very valuable and can't be understated. I mean, I think that that's actually the key to a lot of matchups, like especially minion deck versus minion deck when you're playing the slower minion deck. It's all about drawing your Firefly and just playing the two things right away.
Yeah, keeping your opponent from actually getting a board advantage, especially if it's like Murloc Paladin.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, even just the aggro deck. But so in doing a little bit of reading, we managed to dig up this article by Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa, who's a very famous, prolific Magic player. Has been on the pro scene since I think he was 17. He was like one of the youngest people on the pro circuit.
Yeah, I'm pretty
Um,
sure he won a Pro Tour.
that's awesome. That's so cool. But anyway, regardless, very talented Magic player, but also a really excellent Magic journalist. Writes a lot of really awesome articles.
Hmm.
And in 2010, he wrote this article about tempo, where I pulled this quote from it. It says, "Good tempo means that you have time to play your resources in a way that's beneficial to your end goal, i.e., winning the game." So there, you're defining tempo. Um, in terms of, what it's good, when you have good tempo, what does it mean? When you have like a tempo advantage, it means that you can play your resources to try to advance your game plan. When you have that, so what we were saying and how that might relate to Hearthstone is that when you have bad tempo, it means that you have to spend your resources to not lose.
Yeah, and that is something that can matter more or well, earlier in the game you just have less mana, so you have fewer options.
Right.
And that's sort of that mana differential you're talking about. If you have a 3/3 out on the board, um, you can't just evaluate that. We still don't know how much tempo you have. We don't know, like, if you have a 3/3 and they don't, how much of an advantage are you at? If it's turn 4, kind of an advantage, but they might just slam, a Ascension Shieldmaster, and then suddenly your 3/3 isn't very impressive against a 3/5 taunt. But if it's turn 1 and you have a
Yeah.
3/3, perhaps that when it attacks them, it can adapt. They're really deep in the hole, and your board advantage means more because of how little mana they have. They have fewer options as far as doing something about your minion.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in that example, when you have something extremely overstated on one of the first two turns of the game, it means that your opponent has to spend like an entire card and an entire turn to deal with it at best. So, like you have a 3/3 on turn one, the best your opponent can hope to do is like Wrath or Frostbolted. If they don't have those particular plays, or like they Cabal Lackeyed, played Counterspell. I mean, even then you would have just innervated through that. I don't know. Like there's very few scenarios where they could deal with it without having those particular cards. They could do some funky stuff with like Medivh's Valet in a 2-turn sequence. Anyway, um, they are they have to spend a lot to deal with it.
Yeah, there's not a scenario where they come out ahead.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Yes.
If they're
That's
lucky,
exactly
they
right.
can stop it, but all the other alternatives would be like, well, I mean, do I play this Northshire cleric? Do I play this, do I play my Arcanologist? Like all of the other ways in Hearthstone that you would normally spend your turn otherwise are weak to your opponent having a minion because they get to delete your turn if they have the bigger minion. And so that's the fact that they get to choose their attacks, which is something that you do in Hearthstone and not Magic, is one of the reasons why having that board presence early is so significant for your tempo.
Yeah, yeah, that's why it's a huge tempo gain and not just, advancing some damage to face or something like it might be in Magic, or stopping your opponent from attacking, which it doesn't do in Hearthstone. But like, yeah, I mean, even if they have the perfectly shaped answer, they have the Wrath of the Frostbolt or something like you said, they have to spend the whole turn on it. So let's say you have, board is empty, you play a big thing, you pass turn, they spend all their mana to kill the big thing, they pass turn, the board's still empty. You can still, any play you're making is not dealing with things they've done, it's giving you an advantage relative to your opponent.
And
So,
another example of how it can snowball um, in Hearthstone is with the token druid deck that would play Vicious Fledgling turn 1 with 2 mana, Innervate, Rest in Peace. Would, if you didn't kill it that turn, even if they miss on their adapt, they're probably playing like a Bloodsail Corsair and a Mark of the Lotus and making it a 4/4 and just pumping it and making it even harder and harder for you to kill as you fail to kill it. So they get, as you don't have the answer, you fall further and further behind, and that's because it's a big old snowball,
yep,
a vicious snowball.
Vicious Snowbird. Yeah, it's so yeah, I mean that's basically the definition of tempo. It has to do with your position relative to your opponent. And when you have an advantageous position, whatever that means, you can spend your cards, your life, your attacks to kill your opponent or to advance your game plan. So in a minion deck, that would be just attacking face, dealing face damage. In something like Razakus Priest, spending your cards to advance your game plan is actually just drawing cards. So
Yep.
it just ultimately has to do with how you are able to spend your resources.
And also, uh, what your goal is. When you're playing the minion deck, if you can get control of the board, they don't have any minions and you do, you basically just get to smack them for free.
Right.
And that's how you win, and like it's kind of like it can be easy to not appreciate that that's how you win. It's not really that you win by doing 30 damage. For the most part, if you're playing a minion deck, you're trying to keep minions out and keep them from having minions until you win. Like
Yeah.
it's not really like you don't really need to worry too much about what the number of health they have is until it gets pretty low, until it gets within an amount that you could possibly take out. But for the bulk of the game, um, with most minion decks, most aggro decks, especially mid-range decks, their health total doesn't really matter. You're just trying to maintain a position where you have dudes and they don't, because that will eventually win. Even if it
Right.
gets really late and you have barely anything left and they've got barely anything left, but you've got a guy and they don't, once again, you will probably win over the course of a few turns. Um, so the main way those decks gain tempo is by developing their board or taking something off of the opponent's board.
Yeah. So yeah, that's how they're getting tempo advantages. That's how they're advancing their position, and it makes sense because like I actually have a lot of thoughts about this as it pertains to sort of experience and how to play Hearthstone overall. But like, it's ultimately what you said. If you're playing a minion deck, you're playing what is traditionally called a tempo deck. It's about putting stats on the board and keeping more stats than your opponent has on the board. Because if you do that, just because of how the mana system works, over time you'll be able to make stronger and stronger plays, and so every turn you'll be doing some net average damage to your opponent's face, and if you maintain that average damage over a sufficient number of turns, your opponent's life total will eventually be reduced to zero. It's not about even decks that are called like face decks, it's not just about playing something and attacking your opponent's face and completely ignoring their minions. That's like the Hearthstone meme, right?
Yeah.
But uh it's a little bit more about keeping minions off your opponent's board so that you can maintain steady damage over time. I actually think that like when people start playing Hearthstone, they overtrade, and then they learn about the Smork meme and they undertrade, and they go back to overtrading.
Yeah, there's this
But
oscillation,
yeah,
the pendulum.
but like whether it's I think you made a really good point that your opponent's life total doesn't matter until it's sufficiently low. So one of my favorite quotes from Magic is that life is a resource, not a scoreboard. Um,
Mm.
it's like when you play Patches and the best Patches is doing is just one damage to their face, you feel like you got nothing out of Patches. Patches give you approximately nothing. It doesn't really feel that good. It feels way better when it kills a 2/1 or it finishes off like their 3/3.
Yeah.
And that's because you're using it then to gain a tempo advantage that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten. But when their life is sufficiently low, as we mentioned earlier, dealing damage to their life actually can gain you tempo.
Yeah, there's this critical point, and um, I think there's actually a similarity there with cards in hand. So once again with these tempo decks, um, losing a bunch of cards from your hand and spending a bunch of cards isn't necessarily a big deal if they're dead. So like
Yes, yeah,
losing like a card from your hand, like Soulfire, that's actually huge tempo advantage. That's a huge tempo swing. You're dealing 4 damage for only 1 mana. We don't really need to calculate the one card into tempo because in our Zoolock deck, we win by having a board and them not having a board. And how many cards we have in our hand isn't in that. I would never mention my hand. Um, the only, but there is a point where if you run out of cards and you can't do anything anymore, then you're definitely not going to be able to get a tempo advantage.
yeah,
At the beginning we talked. It's your position and your ability to work towards your goal. Good tempo means that you have time to play your resources in a way that is beneficial to your end goal. Like PV said, if you don't have any resources to spend, then you're not doing anything with your tempo advantage, and that also doesn't win you the game. So
right,
just like with
yeah,
life total, once it gets low enough, now you need to calculate it into your evaluation of tempo, And I think the same is true with cards. At the beginning, when you got a full hand, you really are very willing to spend whatever it takes to keep that board advantage. Um, Theoretically, one thing that you get by having the upper hand in tempo is more card advantage. That's actually maybe one reason why it's okay to be spending more resources on it at the beginning. Um, but once you're down to maybe one or two cards, it's when you have to be more considerate of what you're getting out of it, and not be so
Yeah,
willing to throw cards away to gain advantage. Soulfire can suddenly look a lot less good late in the game.
yeah. If you're top decking, you don't have that many minions on the board. Soulfire is like pretty bad because you're looking to, um, at that point you're looking to develop as much as you can, and like you don't have as many options. Tempo advantages are good to the extent that you can actually capitalize on them. And if you just don't like, if you don't have enough cards to spend all your mana, or you don't have good cards in your hand or in your deck left, then your tempo advantages mean very little.
Yeah, and if also similarly, like if you can maintain that tempo advantage, then you gain card advantage. You make favorable trades, and if you're Warlock, you get the hero power as well.
Right.
So by blowing those two cards on your Soulfire early, that can actually pay itself back.
Totally.
And it's sort of similar with life. Once again, to draw a comparison here, if you're keeping the board advantage, you're probably taking way less damage. So you
Oh yeah.
actually, like, you're very willing to play like your Flame Imp and take 3 damage because your Flame Imp will kill, their Firefly or kill some other minion. So it actually ultimately protects your life total.
Yeah, I mean I think that's part of the reason Rogue and Warlock minion decks are so powerful, is because they are able to sort of directly convert their life into you know, either cards in hand or board position, just resources that they can use to win the game. And
Hmm.
a lot of other classes just don't have access to directly leveraging their life total for those ends. And like the fact that they can sort of, easily convert those is it just gives them more resources, over other types of classes.
Yeah, I mean, Shaman can convert minions into frozen minions.
Burlock.
It's pretty good.
So I mean, Burlock is like probably a pretty decent tempo card. It's just not.
It's positive tempo. I think it's pretty fun.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it could have a place. Needs some more help though. Um, Poor Shaman. So, it's how do you evaluate tempo? So we spent all this time talking about your position, but like evaluating your position is non-trivial. I think that it took me a really long time to be able to understand several turns ahead whether I was going to win or lose a game. So a lot of early concedes didn't make sense to me. I just like spent a lot of time not conceding games, even when I was doomed,
Hmm.
which is probably still correct. But
Say most
I
of the
guess
time it is.
yeah. I think it depends if you're trying to maximize wins over time, or you're trying to maximize wins per game. Whatever ratio is your objective function, sets your concession level. But so to evaluate tempo, like there's a pretty simple question that you should actually be basically asking yourself every game, every turn when you're playing anyway, which is, after I make this play, what am I doing next turn? So you have a play that you're imagining doing because you haven't played the cards yet, because you think about your plays, and
Yep,
you
definitely do
imagine.
that.
It's yeah, I mean, it's not trivial, right? It's easy to play this game on autopilot.
Don't just grab the
Um,
green thing and click enter.
Backstab is green. So, um, you you imagine there's a play you want to make, and you think about what the end result of the play is going to be. You think about what they're going to have left, and what your board's going to look like, what their attacks are going to be, what cards are perhaps in their hand, how much mana they have, what cards does that give them access to. All of those things you consider, like, given all of that stuff, when I untap, what is my board going to look like, and will I be spending the cards in my hand to advance my position, or will I be spending the cards in my hand to catch up? um, so this is relatively easy in the first few turns of the game, where everybody's plays are somewhat stereotyped, and you don't have to worry about combinations of cards so much. You just have to worry about individual cards because people have like up the 3 mana, so they're not playing multiple cards per turn.
Right.
Um, at that point, you're having your minions out and setting up your attack such that your opponent has fewer options or their options don't deal with everything. That's going to give you the tempo advantage. If you find that after your plays you've maybe decreased their life total a little bit, or you haven't advanced your board very much, and they're most likely going to have stuff over you on the board that you're going to have to deal with, and the only way you can deal with it is to spend most of your mana that turn and some of the cards in your hand, then you're at a tempo disadvantage.
Which is bad.
Yes. Yeah, you want to be at a tempo advantage.
And that's especially bad if you're both playing a minion deck. Because that means you both have the same goal, which is to have tempo, and they're succeeding and you're failing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it means you're both basically fighting for the same resource, which is board position, and you're both gaining tempo by gaining board position. And so, if your relative board looks worse, then you're worse off. You have tempo disadvantage.
And that is most of Hearthstone and most decks, and that's why generally if someone's talking about a tempo swing or a tempo play or a tempo deck, they're talking about a minion-based deck.
Yeah, totally. Tempo Rogue has 26 minions in it. It's like that's a
They're
tempo
all
deck.
patches.
Yeah, I mean they're all really good. Oh, too good perhaps.
But yeah, we did mention these really general definitions of tempo, which we like, but most often when people are talking about tempo in Hearthstone, it is about the board and board control, and that's because a lot of the decks are going to be aggro, mid-range tempo decks, and even if both aren't in a matchup, as long as one is, the board really matters.
Right.
And that's almost always the case.
Yeah. There's very few games in Hearthstone where that's not the case. I mean, if you're like a razakus main or something, maybe you're going to play those matchups all the time.
Well, you can feel so like you can tell when you're watching like maybe back in the day Control Warrior versus Control Warrior matchup, or nowadays Razakus Priest versus Razakus Priest, that those matchups are like different than most Hearthstone games, and it's because of how much tempo has changed from being about the board to being about people's hands.
Right.
And that's not common in Hearthstone.
Yeah. Yeah, because in Razakus is tuned to be able to beat decks that are putting minions on the board every single turn. So if you're playing a control deck, you're not doing that. So, you're not going to just take your Cabal Talon Priest and go to town with them. That's not really how the game's going to go. Sometimes it will, and those are funny games. But, like, most of the time it's not going to work out like that. So, that you should spend your resources on doing other things.
Yeah, both players have very few aggressive minion plays and a lot of answers. Yeah. So it isn't the winner isn't so much the person that has a really aggressive series of attacks, but the winning combo. And so this is sort of how Magic is less about the board. This theoretical matchup where both people are sitting there not really doing much on the board happens all the time.
Oh yeah, depending on the format, that's most of the matchups. Yeah,
and there is still interaction sometimes with like Thoughtseize might come out, or a Duress, or a tutor effect, and then both players see that one player got a specific card. So there's still things happening in exchange of information. It's just it doesn't seem like anyone's doing anything, and that's just how Magic is, and Magic tempo isn't so strictly or so often just talking about board state, but it definitely is mostly about that in Hearthstone.
Yeah, I think that also has something. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. They're very, very different games, and I think in Hearthstone, because you're making all your decisions on your turn, and most of your decisions have to do with attacks, and like because of the structure of Hearthstone, because of how the control cards work, they're all sorcery speed. Most decks in Hearthstone are just minion decks, and so tempo often reverses the board. But yeah, like we'd mentioned, some decks are not winning with minions, and if you're playing one of those decks, uh, you can evaluate tempo by asking yourself something like, okay, well, I have 6 mana right now. Do I have to drop this Dragonfire Potion? Or, 7 mana, do I have to drop this Psychic Scream? Or can I afford to play my Kazakus and get a 5 mana potion? Do I have to get a 1 mana potion? Or instead, do I have to deal with something immediately? Can I afford to just play Raza and Hero Power and maybe burn 2 mana? Like, if I do that, am I going to be taking way too much damage? These are all the questions that you're asking to determine whether or not you have a positional advantage.
Yeah, and the Raza deck is not like it doesn't care about the board. A lot of its cards affect the board. It takes things off instead of putting things on. A
Right.
lot of the tempo decks, like maybe the most, the best example would be Token Druid about winning by putting a lot of stuff on the board. The Token Druid deck had no removal. It would just play a lot of stuff and make it really fat. And
Yep.
that was basically all about positive tempo. Razakus is very much about reducing your opponent's tempo, and actually gaining tempo based on how far ahead they are. So that's what a board wipe essentially does. Your opponent has spent resources to advance their position and put themselves in a really good position. And the better position they put themselves in, the more the area of effect removal, the more the board wipe will put them back, and the more you take away from them. And so the Razakus deck, even though it's not trying to win by getting a board position that has minions on it that kills its opponent, it still is really good at gaining tempo. Like Potion of Madness, like that for 1 mana, that can be a huge board change. You can get a 2/2 and a 3/2 off the board, which is a lot of stuff for just 1 mana.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean in some scenarios, Potion of Madness is just a straight 2-for-1, and like you take your opponent off of 2 turns worth of plays for the low price of 1 mana, which like the reason its mana cost matters here, and when we're talking about tempo, it's not enough to just say like you spent all your mana to kill 2 of their things and 2-for-1 them. You spent 1 mana because now you have some amount of mana left over to advance your game plan, to like play an Novice Engineer or to play a Radiant Elemental, so you can trade on a future turn, so that you can play some other card that draws cards.
Yeah, if you can wipe their guys and have enough mana for the Cabal Talon Priest you mentioned, you're really happy about it, but not because you expect to hit them in the face with Cabal Talon Priest until they die.
Right.
Like if you can use a cheap card to kill your opponent's minion, then play a Bear Shark, you might be like, well, I'm going to Houndmaster this Bear Shark and Crackling Razor Maw, and like this Bear Shark's going to kill this guy. You don't feel that way about your Talon Priest, but you're still really happy about it. Like if you just cleared your opponent and played a Talon Priest against a minion deck, some aggressive deck, you're really happy because your Talon Priest is going to be able to kill their guys.
Yeah.
But once again, it's about the board. Once again, the board is something that you really have to look at and you really want to have control over, even though you're playing Razakus.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
But it's
that
it's positive tempo whether you're playing aggro or control, but the reason is different because your goal is different.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's that you can like, because when you have positive tempo, you're spending your resources to just deal gradual damage to your opponent's life. But in Razakus, you're using them to dig for a combo, or you're using them to play the combo. So how do you get tempo? I mean, it's something we discussed a lot, throughout all the previous sections here.
We just mentioned that a board wipe is a great way to gain a lot of tempo.
Yeah, or a cheap removal spell like Potion of Madness that deals with a lot of stuff because it leaves you, mana left over to spend on developing your advantage.
Yeah, a lightning bolt can be a lot of tempo if it kills a really big minion with 3 health like a Houndmaster. And that's why it doesn't really, like, killing a 2/2 with lightning bolt that's really not that much tempo because you're paying 1 mana overload 2 mana to get rid of a 2/2. And that's why
Yeah, it's
that
like
play doesn't feel very good. It's because it's not really positive tempo.
right. It's like just a 1 for 1. Like you're kind of going even on resources there. It's like It's like you played a 2/2 to blank their 2/2. Like you didn't come out ahead there. You just kind of set everyone to parity. And if that's all you're doing, then you didn't actually you pass the turn and your opponent still has tempo advantage because anything they play is going to be to advance their game plan. It's not going to be to deal with something you did.
Yeah, but you spending your turn keeping things even isn't getting you ahead. It's keeping things even. If you kill
Right.
something that costs 4 mana, like a 4/3, or something bigger than that, that's when you're swinging it in your favor. So yeah, just really cheap removal used efficiently.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the reason backstab is so insane. Because it just doesn't cost any mana at
Yeah,
all,
it doesn't
and it
get
can
much
be like
cheaper than that.
yeah. So I mean that plus your weapon can kill like a lot of stuff, a lot of the important stuff that minion decks are going to play, like almost everything, and that will like just allow you to spend the rest of your mana on other stuff, to spend your mana on like Cobalt Scalebane or something.
And
Um,
backstab can also set up your combo cards, like our friend SI7 Agent, which is basically another style of card that gives you a big tempo swing.
Yeah, yeah. So when speaking about, gaining tempo, I think that it's a good time to talk about, the tempo swing. What a lot of people mean when they say that is they're talking about a card. I mean, like in past episodes, we've used it like this. I use it almost synonymously to refer to cards like SI7 Agent, Firelance Portal, Vilespine Slayer, just cards that both put a body on your board and remove one of theirs. So,
Hmm.
why is that a tempo swing? Because maybe they're ahead, maybe they have an advantageous or an even board position relative to you. If you remove anything of theirs, then you can take away their advantage and you put something on the board and give yourself the advantage. So if the board's relatively even and you do that, that's massive. You just killed like their biggest thing and gave yourself an additional thing. Like chances are you're very far ahead of them on the board now.
Yeah,
Um, for for something like you know Vilespine Slayer, even on turn 5 or turn 6, 3/4 is still a reasonable body. That's still going to tango with most cards they're playing, and it's gonna kill something that like it couldn't tango with. It can kill a Cobalt Scalebane or something like that. So it's a very easy way to get a good board position because a lot of these cards will just, in addition to giving you a better board position by giving you a minion, they're going to take your opponent off of some mana and off of some cards.
yeah, and so if it, the real swing is if you're behind because you don't have anything and they're ahead because they have something, and then you play Firelance Portal, and it's like, who's the big play now? You got nothing and I got something.
Right, yeah, like if they have like a 5/5 or something on board and you have nothing and that's the only thing on the board, if you play Firelance Portal, you're just ahead. You're like, your opponent untaps and they're like, okay, now I'm facing down something that I may need to kill.
So you
And
you
like,
swung the tempo advantage.
right, yeah, you took tempo advantage away from them and you didn't just gain tempo, you gained more tempo than them. You were like sort of removed tempo from them and gained it yourself. Um,
Yeah, if your opponent has the advantage, often you're happy with evening it out, or that might be the often be the best you can do.
yeah,
And cards like Firelance Portal and Vilespine are just really good at giving you way more than that.
yeah. I mean, that's what decks like. Speaking of evening it out, like that's what decks like razakus are living and breathing on. They're like
Hmm.
they're hoping, okay, I can even it out enough times, and I can gain relative card advantage by like 2-for-1ing my opponent. Deleting 2 of their cards with 1 of mine. I can do that enough times and even out tempo enough times that my opponent will run out of resources. And once they've run out of resources, they'll be putting less pressure on me, and I can afford to just draw a bunch of cards and play my combo.
Yeah,
And
they aren't really in too much of a rush. Like they just need to not die, and they'll kill you.
I mean that's true
So
though.
that's they can devote most of their cards to just resets that make everything even. But they never invested anything in the board, so they don't care. And like we mentioned earlier, there's this critical point where suddenly how many cards in your hand does matter. And if they do enough resets, eventually it will impede the aggressive player that had the tempo advantage.
Yeah, it's that is it's a different game that they're playing. Um, but yeah, a lot of the tempo swinging cards are kind of just things that both simultaneously remove and develop something.
Oh, Duskbreaker is a really good example.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, Dustbreaker's a really good one.
And I mean, Patches is really positive tempo. And in particular, we mentioned how getting tempo earlier matters more. When they have less mana to deal with the board presence you're getting, your board presence is relatively better. So the fact that you can get Patches turn 1 really consistently is part of why he's so good. It's that early board presence gives you a tempo advantage.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's you're hoping to use it for that. You're hoping to use it to kill something of your opponent so that you can make way for your 2 mana play or something, or your 3 mana play more commonly these days. Um, so those types of minions that basically just have removal stapled to them for free. Those are like really efficient on cards, and they tend to be really efficient on mana. As we mentioned, very cheap removal. So backstab and lightning bolt are, less lightning bolt, more backstab are two good examples because they can deal with something moderately sized, and they leave you a bunch of mana left over to advance your game plan. So they do the part where your opponent got at a small advantage on you. They can take away that small advantage, but you didn't spend all of your resources doing it. You spent a card. That's not nothing. A card is something, but you still have all your mana left over. Maybe 3 to 5 mana left over to do something.
And they spent a card on their guy, ideally. So
Yeah,
you're not really
right.
negative cards.
Yeah. You might be sort of neutral on total card spend.
But that sort of illustrates why bother playing removal. Like, they have a card, I have a card, and then I have one less and they have one less. Why bother doing it? It can give you positive tempo, especially if your removal was way cheaper than their minion. It can give you a lot of tempo. That's
right.
why cheap removal's good. This
right,
is
exactly.
the answer to that question.
If you if every turn you're spending 2 mana to get a 2/2, and your opponent's spending 2 mana to get a 2/2, but you're using the rest of your mana to sort of remove stuff, and they're just playing bigger stuff. Like, if you can kill other bigger stuff with your cheaper things, like you're gonna have a lot more mana left over. You're gonna be able to use more mana to develop the board than they're using. So cheap removal trades up in mana. That's something that's like nebulous. It took me a while to understand why that matters at all, and it's because the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is that, like, when they could have spent all of that mana to like kill something of yours and play something smaller, but they invested it in a big thing, and you played something relatively small and dealt with their thing. So I guess that's not exactly opportunity cost, but it's like just what are you able to use the leftover mana for? So your opponent spent 4 mana and you spent 1 mana killing it. Now you're up 3 mana. What are you using that 3 mana for? And the answer is like to play something, to play a minion or something.
Yeah, you can get yourself further ahead, or if they have more threats, take those out too.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in Magic, a lot of the most prolific removal in the game, a lot of like some of the format-defining cards, Path to Exile, Fatal Push, Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt. These cards all have in common that they're incredibly cheap removal.
Yeah, it's really clutch being 1 mana removal in Magic, especially when Magic also has cards that like kind of like, wow, Vicious Fledgling is really fair relative.
Yeah.
Like that 1 mana plays, turn 1 plays that crap all over Innervate, Vicious Fledgling. So being a 1 mana removal spell will be a life or death scenario. But even with Lightning Bolt, just that's not going to kill a Darksteel Colossus, but it could kill their really early creature. And like we said, that really early creature is a lot of tempo. So being able to remove it is a lot of tempo for you.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Cheap removal, really good. It's good in every game. It's because it gives you tempo advantage. It allows you to spend more mana on developing your board than your opponent did, or at least like to better effect. So weapons tend to be good too. Like, as far as weapons are good, they're interesting. So if you think about the amount of damage per mana that a weapon can do, it's actually like usually a pretty good deal. It's definitely a better deal than a lot of spot removal spells. And the reason for that is because you're also trading some life off. So it's converting some of the cost of that damage from mana to life. Think of Rallying Blade, which is going to be 3 mana for 6 damage in total, on 2 targets. That would normally cost like 4 to 5 mana.
Yep, there's
and maybe
Fireball.
2 cards. Yeah, right. Fireball being one of the most efficient examples there. That's 4 mana for 6 damage. Something like Rallying Blade is going to be 3 mana for 6 damage in total, split up as you like. Of course, that doesn't mean it's just better than Fireball. Obviously, they're different cards. They have different cases where they're useful and different weaknesses. But the fact that it's cheaper and can do a fair amount of damage, can do sort of more damage than you would expect for its cost, means that that fictitious mana that you didn't spend on, like compared to something like Fireball, you can spend to develop your board. You have like 1 additional mana to develop your board or something. So that's why like 1 or 2 turns after a couple attacks from a weapon, 1 or 2 turns after it's been played, the person who played it will often be ahead on board because they took their opponent off options, they killed what their opponent was playing, even if it was reasonably sized, and they used all of their mana to develop while they were doing that with their weapon.
Yeah, it's like you said, if you just go even, like if Rallying Blade only had 1 swing, that wouldn't be very good. Because it would just keep you even. They have a 3/3. You're on your 3rd turn. You pay 3 mana to kill their 3/3. That's not a tempo advantage. That's just keeping it even. But the fact that next turn you're going to be able to chop something else. So now you've gotten a 3 mana minion plus something else. Now you're positive. Now you're net positive because you only paid 3 mana for your Rallying Blade. Though, like you said, the way this is evened out is because you'll probably be negative on health. But as we mentioned much earlier, that can easily not matter. If you just maintain the tempo lead, your life total never matters.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of games I've had as a rogue where I felt like I was ahead all game, and I felt like I stood no chance of losing at any point, and I won the game with like 13 health left.
Yeah, you can get, especially the rogue, because you're just poking stuff with your little daggers. Right. But it can happen with Paladin too. You're just not paying attention and smacking stuff with your weapons. You're like, well, I have 14 and he's playing mage. I should probably at least think before I do my next attack. But yeah, that is often at the early points of the game an amazing deal. Trading health for board position is very much what you want to do. And Rallying Blade is really good for that.
Yeah, because in the early portions of the game, it's very unlikely that your opponent can reduce your health total to like low enough that you have to start respecting their stuff more.
Yeah,
that's just it's not gonna happen.
Oh, I was at 27 instead of 30, so he got me on turn 3, like that.
Yeah, that just isn't a thing that happens in Hearthstone, not very often at least.
Fortunately.
Yeah, so like the fact that you're at like 3 less life just doesn't matter because you can, if you win the game at 1 life or you win the game at 30 life, you win the game at 40 life, it's all the same. You still just won the game. It's not like it's a scoreboard. It's a resource, not a scoreboard. So another one that's like sort of a tempo swing that took me a little bit. I kind of realized it intuitively, and then I took a little bit of sort of thinking about it to explain it. Taunt minions. So taunt minions are definitely tempo swingy because they take options away from your opponent.
Right.
So, like, even if your opponent is ahead on board, technically, because their minions are better than yours, or they can sort of deal with what you have, or even deal with your taunt minion, if you play a taunt minion, you've now put up a roadblock that your opponent has to punch through. They have to spend some amount of resources, be that cards, or mana, or attacks, to punch, and, like, health on their minions, to punch through whatever the toughness of your taunt minion is. After that, after they spend those resources, they have the rest of their resources to advance their board position or deal with the rest of your board. So, like, a lot of the time, that's part of the reason Tar Creeper is so good, because not only is it like just incredibly overstated, but it for anything played on turn 3 or before, it basically walls it off completely. So you can play just some stupid 2-drop or a few 1-drops and then play a Tar Creeper and maintain a massive tempo advantage because your opponent, even if they could deal with your 1 or 2 drops with the minions they have on board or with like removal in their hand or whatever, not that they would want to spend removal on that, they can't attack through the Tar Creeper. They can't like actually execute those attacks because you have this massive, like disgustingly huge 3/5 taunt in the way.
Yeah, the point the point of getting the tempo advantage is that you get to have these free attacks. And Tar Creeper
Right.
just says, I don't care what you have and what you're doing, you don't get to attack anymore. You don't get to execute your goal. I, however, do.
Yes. Right. Whatever you have behind your taunt is good. That's another reason why Bone Mare is so good, is that like in addition to it just being like, basically 7 mana 9/9 4/4 if it has charge, you get a taunt out, which means you can screw up your opponent's attacks. Because like even if they could threaten lethal damage, because at that point in the game that's very likely, or they have like really good attacks on your minions, if you just make the right one a huge taunter, suddenly their good attacks become terrible attacks.
Mm-hmm. The attacks that they would have into that pumped minion or the attacks into Tar Creeper are usually really inefficient, and
Yes.
ultimately the Tar Creeper, if it hits, if 3 minions go into it, it just dealt 9 damage because it deals 3 damage each time. Or if you bone mared a 3/3, now you got to trade into that. That thing is going to do a ton of damage and cost you a lot of tempo trying to get through it. So you kind of might have an option of going through it, but that's still also really a negative tempo.
Yeah. So it's the taunt minions is sort of like it's a less obvious way that you can gain tempo. And yeah, the like you said, Bone Mare is going to end up, it's going to make one of your minions just do like 1 billion damage and take your opponent off a lot of mana. They're going to have to spend, like, in the worst case for them, a ton of mana and a ton of cards, maybe like 2 4-drops or something, which is like 2 whole cards and 8 mana. That's so much to deal with just like half of your Bone Mare.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives you such a big card advantage. It gives you such a big like mana advantage. It leaves you on the board in a good spot. It's also, this is an opportune time to just mention that, like, value, tempo, card advantage, life advantage, all this stuff is like not mutually exclusive. And
Yeah.
you shouldn't try to fit them all into mutually exclusive categories, because then you end up with like the reductionist definitions, or you end up with these definitions that aren't useful, or you end up just missing the point of the discourse. It's not to come up with mutually exclusive definitions, it's to come up with practical definitions. So the definition of tempo that we're using and have been using the whole time really encompasses all this stuff. It encompasses card advantage, board advantage, life advantage, but also, positional advantage.
Yeah, those are all ultimately parts of it. We mentioned when you can ignore them, but that means there are times when you can't.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, no vernacular that I'm aware of is like just or a bunch of like a basis, right? It's not just a bunch of orthogonal words.
Yeah, they're
like, there's
all
overlap and stuff.
intricately connected concepts.
Right. Exactly. That are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
It's beautiful.
It's language. So another class of cards that could potentially be tempo advantages, time warps. So cards that buy you turns.
Mm-hmm.
Time warp is of course the that's the card that says take an extra turn, right? But things like Ice Blocker, the Valera Death Knight, these are going to buy you another turn to try to advance your game plan. So what does that mean? In the late game, that means 10 more mana. That's what Ice Block means. In the case of Valera, it might mean that your opponent has no attacks. They can't attack, period.
Yep, they got null tempo that turn.
Yeah, that's the same thing as like Frost Noving. And Frost Nova is another, decent example of this kind of thing. So, these cards are all, or Blizzard, these cards are all going to just buy you time. And time is ultimately a resource, because it means that, as more time elapses, you draw more cards and gain more mana. And those are actually resources. So, those types of effects can be tempo positive also.
Yeah, that's basically just a straight up tempo boost. When it's something like Time Warp, though, it very much has to do with what extra you have, sort of like with the removal spells. How much tempo you're going to gain off of Time Warp has to do with how much more mana you have to spend on other stuff.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the time,
same with Frost Nova.
after Yeah, mostly Frost Nova and Ice Block and stuff. A lot of the time when you Time Warp, you're just going to win the game on the spot.
Yeah, given that the nature of the deck that tends to be playing it.
Yes, exactly.
But
Not necessarily though.
yeah, like generally, like Frost Nova isn't something you want to do on turn 3. It doesn't swing tempo very much turn 3. When your opponent has a huge amount of damage that's supposed to kill you, so now the life total is relevant, and then Frost Nova completely stops them. That's a big tempo swing.
Yeah, actually, Doomsayer fits into this category too, I think.
Yeah, they would either have to kill him or kill you sometime, or damage you.
Yeah, and I mean, if you play it on turn 2, it means that they can't spend their mana on like minions. It basically just buys you an extra turn worth of mana relative to them.
Yeah, in the early game, it can be a huge tempo play, colossal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if at that point people have only gained a total of like 5 mana crystals over the first 2 or 3 turns, um, if your opponent had to spend 2 of those mana crystals on passing the turn, then you have a massive advantage. You're able to develop many more resources than they
Yeah,
are.
they'll be on a blank board, and you'll have a turn to
So
do something.
um, why don't we talk about non-aggro decks a little bit? Tempo.
Sounds good.
Sure.
There's the obvious ways of gaining tempo in the aggressive decks and the minion decks are by playing minions, or if you're playing against a minion deck, you can kill their minions. But if you're not playing one of these aggressive decks and your opponent doesn't have anything out, what do you do? How do you gain tempo? What's your best way to spend your resources? And that's going to depend on your deck. We already mentioned razakus. You largely want to just draw. If you have wiped your opponent's board and stopped them from damaging you, you can spend cards like Kazakus and Shadow Visions on trying to dig deeper into your deck and get closer to your combo, because that's how you win. That's the goal. So that would be drawing a bunch of cards to be positive tempo. Also, if you can stick some kind of minion with high health or something that manages to damage your opponent a couple times, that's also going to sort of give you positive tempo because they're now closer to that critical number where they die.
Yeah, or if you stick like, the Talon Priest, go back to that card, you stick that or a card like that, it means that you can trade with something they play later.
Yeah, it's not like the old-fashioned playing a minion method of gaining tempo isn't positive tempo in razakus. It's just that the deck has another way to gain tempo, and that's something that all of these non-aggro decks sort of share, is this resilience to removal by having a way to advance their goal, advance their game plan without that being developing the board. Because when your main goal is to develop the board, you become weak to things like Psychic Scream and Dragonfire Potion and Wild Pyromancer quality, Wildfire. I guess that too. So by being able to develop and work towards a goal that isn't on the board, you can avoid being weak to those cards. Say, cards like Vilespine Slayer are also not very good against razakus. Another deck that, this one's definitely more minion based, Jade Druid, right? Like, removal is going to be good against it. But if you're playing Jade Druid and your opponent plays Doomsayer, you might actually have a lot you can do to still work towards your goal. And that's because the goal of Jade Druid's not just to get board control, it's also just to make really large men, to make really large men. You can do that with more mana and more cards. So summoning a bigger Jade, even if they have a Doomsayer out, it still works you toward your goal. Really no other deck gets closer to winning by playing a minion into Doomsayer. But Jade Druid is capable of doing that. It can also just play like a Wild Growth or a Nourish to get mana or cards.
Totally. Yeah, which is a little bit more like razakus, where you're using your mana to sort of draw or gain a resource. In this case, mana. Jade Druid can convert its mana now into more mana later. Basically put it on layaway and, just get mana faster than the opponent and play bigger stuff later. So But also, I think that the Jade Golem example is another really good one. Is that even if you spend 4 mana for a Jade Spirit that makes a 1/1 Jade Golem, you've still gained more than just that 1/1 and the 2/3. You've gained the fact that your Jade Golem is going to be like +1/+1. It's going to be a little bit harder for your opponent to deal with. It's going to be a little bit better, and um, even in the face of board wipes, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a tempo advantage ultimately. Like back in Frozen Throne when everybody was playing Jade Druid, that was a mirror match that I learned really well. And I realized that like the games that I won, the games that felt really easy were the ones where I was just spending all my mana on developing Jade Golems, and I was just putting out a board and like chipping at my opponent and taking decent trades when they were there. But like there came a point in the later game when like maybe we both ultimate infestation, but I was making 6/6s and my opponent was making 4/4s.
Yeah, it's we said this really early in this episode, but tempo is a lot about what am I going to do next turn, and this
right.
really sort of sends that home. And that's just like as much as Dragonfire Potion can be good against a Jade Druid deck, eventually it's not. And you don't think of Dragonfire Potion as like one of the great cards against Jade Druid, and that's
Right.
because it can do a lot of work to advance its goal, advance towards its goal without changing the board, without doing anything to the
Yes.
board, or by changing things that you can't touch. You can't turn their Jade count down. Sadly,
Right.
the closest you can do to interacting with that is Skulking Geist. Fortunately, there's
Right.
kind of a way to interact with it, but really, every time they play a Jade card, they've gained a permanent advantage that your removal can't reduce.
Yeah, totally. And that's tempo. That gives them tempo relative to you because later on they're going to be able to convert their mana to more value because of that resource that they've gained, which is their J count.
And there's also Freeze Mage. This one's like really similar to razakus in that it just wants to develop a hand and also deal face damage. But razakus sort of wins in a stupid way by just using cards that don't do anything to trigger the hero power and then kill you with that. So it's indirect. Freeze Mage's cards directly do damage, like Pyroblast and Fireball. So there might come a point where you just have a bunch of burn in your hand and you just want to start playing it. And really very rarely do we think of just playing Fireball on someone who's at 30 health, because that is generally negative tempo. In most cases, you would rather either wait to see if you can kill a big minion with the Fireball, as we talked about how that would be positive tempo, or it can threaten lethal or get you lethal when they're not at 30. But when they're at 30, you spent 4 mana and did not affect the board. So that usually is an awful play, but in Freeze Mage, that can actually be what you want to do, because your game is much less about the board and much more about their life total. Your Frost Nova will freeze a 1/1 just as well as it will freeze an army of 10/10s. So the board becomes something that you get to ignore. And if you might see a Freeze Mage just fireball you when you're at 30. And that's because their goal is different. And what gives them positive tempo is different.
They just need to draw a certain set of cards and then spend like roughly 30 mana. And if they can spend 30 mana in this like set of cards that they have in their deck, then in this card pool, then you're going to lose the game.
But if they do it improperly and they don't maintain enough board advantage and enough tempo with their Frost Novas and their Ice Blocks, then they die. We talked about how Ice Block is actually positive tempo, and that's what the Freeze Mage needs to use to be able to have the time to execute its goal of dealing 30 damage. And then, once again, really similar to these other decks in that it wants to develop its hand. Quest Mage has resilience to removal spells and stuff like that because it's just trying to assemble this group of cards that you can't do anything to. I guess Dirty Rat is the one way to interact with this kind of strategy, but that's only one Hearthstone card. But unlike the other ones, it doesn't really even get tempo out of damaging your face.
Right,
So
right.
that this is sort of even like healing yourself can feel like you're doing something pretty relevant against a freeze mage or a razakus player. Like you really might feel like you put them behind again if you gain a lot of health out of nowhere. You do
Right.
not feel that way against quest mage.
Yeah, because they kind of like it's a very extreme example of a deck that converts cards and mana into beating you. You know, they have to spend a ton of mana to trigger their quest, and then they spend a lot of mana all at once on these cards that they drew, but then you just lose instantly.
Yeah, and so their tempo with regard to the board is only about stopping you. It's
Yes.
really even a freeze mage might be happy about keeping an Alexstrasza out on the board, but like really there's not no addition involved. It's all about subtraction.
Yeah, I like almost never trade when I play against that deck. I only trade if it means like the amount of damage that I dealt to the minions is less than the amount of damage I expect to deal by killing the minion. That's like, those. I'm sorry, those are the conditions. Yeah, those are the conditions under which I don't trade, and that's often the condition in which I do trade is like when killing their minion means I get to keep another one around more that will ultimately do more damage. It's just like it's actually very simple. It's a DPS race playing against quest mage, and
Yeah,
so you just don't want to trade all that often if you can avoid it.
but
Because like they don't, if their arcanologist hits you for two, that means nothing to them. They basically didn't get to use that attack if it has to go to your face. So like if you see that you have two 5/5s out and they have an arcanologist, like you should never kill that thing with your attacks. You should kill it with like a backstab and a weapon if you have it, if that.
yeah, the best thing that they can do with that Arcanologist is drive it into one of your guys to kill it. And
Yeah.
since that is the best thing they can do with it, you shouldn't do it for them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's another thing I sort of neglected to mention earlier. I think a lot of over trading when you're sort of a less experienced Hearthstone player is failing to think about like, well, does my opponent want this to happen? Also, is this a trade that my opponent would be happy making? Like, does my opponent is my opponent benefiting more from this trade? Like, if so, let them do it.
Yeah, and that if you look at the goal of their deck and how much board presence matters to their strategy and how much board presence gives them tempo, you can sort of evaluate that.
Yeah, it's always pretty tough, but yeah, there's so a lot of different decks, a lot of different ways to get tempo. Most of it has to do with minions, but not
But
always.
so one reason we wanted to do this topic now is because of the nature of standard, right? And just
Yes,
how
yeah,
um, tempo heavy, where tempo's talking about board presence, all the decks are, and how quickly and sort of in a degenerate manner, a lot of the best decks will develop their board and develop a lot of tempo.
yeah. I mean, tempo rogue is like tempo rogue is the name of the deck because there's a lot of tempo swingy cards in it. It's that it can be losing on board and then just like, oops, I'm really far ahead now. But ultimately every deck is going to be able to generate tempo in some capacity. This one's just has particularly good cards for advancing its game plan, and um, can spend very few cards and very few mana crystals on getting there. And so it's like especially good at it. It's basically just a good stuff deck. It's a mid range deck. It's like a good deck, and that's why it's called Tempo Rogue.
Yeah, I mean it's that's like the best thing to be good at in Hearthstone, and it's really good at it. Uh,
Yeah. So it's
the negative tempo aspect, the removal aspect, is also a big part of it because we don't call it's not like tempo Murloc Paladin. It's just Murloc Paladin, and sure, it wins because it generates a ridiculous amount of tempo by playing a couple of cheap Murlocs and then buffing them all. That
right.
you spent very little mana for how many stat points you're getting with Gentle Megasaur, because that's already a lot of stats without the battle cry. So
Right.
certainly it's winning with tempo and by generating a lot of it, but it's just generating it. And this tempo rogue deck will play against a Murloc deck and develop its own board and give itself positive tempo while taking away the Murloc players' Murlocs and give them negative tempo, and that's sort of what makes this rogue deck the boss of tempo.
Yeah, yeah. It just like doesn't care about how you are gaining tempo. It doesn't care about how you're advancing your board, what kind of minions you're playing, and advancing your game plan. It can deal with it. Vilespine Slayer is an indiscriminate killer. So that's I think that's part of it, certainly, is that like it's just able to generate tempo advantages against anything. Whereas there's going to be a certain class of deck, maybe a taunt warrior, that something like Murloc Paladin would be particularly bad against.
Yep, but even if you're playing that taunt warrior deck, like you fear and respect Vilespine Slayer, because eventually
Totally. Right.
you would want to invest more mana into bigger taunts, and that's where they can get a huge tempo advantage on you with a Vilespine Slayer.
Yeah. Right. Do you think that's a good place to wrap up?
Yeah, I think that would be on perfect tempo.
Actually, I think there's one more thing I had forgotten.
I guess I'm wrong.
We forgot to mention. I was also wrong. Sorry, I faked you out there. Corridor Creeper. So I think it's important to mention how this card fits into this discussion, because I think it's a big part of why this feels like a tempo-oriented metagame. Corridor Creeper is a 0 mana 5/5. Talk about spending resources to develop your board. That's it. If you listen to this episode right away, you should know, like, oh, it's because it costs you 1 card and no mana for a like disgusting amount of stats. You thought South Sea Captain was broken. Like, take a look at this guy. I mean, they work together. We all saw Raynet's video, etc., etc. But at the core of it, it's a ton of stats on the board for up to 0, for as little as 0 mana.
Yeah, I mean, it could even just be 3 mana 5/5, and you're very happy about it.
Totally. 4 mana, I love that card.
I think it's also worth mentioning it's as good as it is because of patches. Like, it wouldn't be as insane if there weren't lots of decks throwing out a random extra free 1/1 to die within the first few turns of the game. That definitely contributes to how frequently this can be this insane deal. But once you look at how good of a deal it can be, and how good a cheap early minion is, how much of an advantage that gives you in Hearthstone, that clears up how this sort of vanilla-looking minion can be so good.
Yeah,
you just get to have the tempo advantage and destroy all of your opponent's minions for a very low amount of mana.
Yep, and that's Corridor Creeper, and that's why it's in 43% of decks. That's so gross. I think we can finish up now.
Yeah, I'm. That's just another. It's just yet another way Patches is cancerous, and I'm looking forward to to him leaving, because he makes other cards even more cancerous than they're supposed to be.
I cannot wait for him to be gone. Hopefully just not see so many 26 minion decks anymore. If you like 26 minion decks, we can give you 27 minion decks on twitter.com/lastturnhs or facebook.com/lastturnhs. As always, you can also find 27 minion decks on iTunes. You can find us there. You can find us on soundcloud.com/lastturn. You can also find our YouTube channel on YouTube. That's where our YouTube channel is. If you search Last Turn, Last Turn HS. So, and as always, we're on other places too, like Player FM or Pocket Cast, Beyond Pod.
And we have lastturnhs.com.
That's true. We have lastturnhs.com. You can come check us out there. We have links to most of our social media and the websites on which we host our content.
Lots of the ones we just mentioned, iTunes, SoundCloud, etc.
Yep. Come check us out. Follow us. Recommend us to your friends. We like to think that we have fun conversations about Hearthstone. We hope you enjoy it, and spread the word.
And if you have any other topics or ideas you'd like us to talk about, or definitely let us know. If you have any complaints, don't tell us.
Definitely tell us. Listen to us. Just don't put us on blast. We'll catch you guys next turn.
See you next turn, guys.